All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Manglona Labs interviewing witnesses to HerStory. I am Bethany Scholes. I am the director of the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity, and I'm an assistant clinical professor here at Penn State Law. As part of the Manglona Lab's work, we are capturing the personal experiences of women, focusing on their participation in education, sports, and the workforce during a dynamic period in the United States. As you can see from the timeline on our website, between 1963 and 1978, there were significant changes in the law that affected women in fundamental ways. So we only highlight a few. We've got, of course, the 1963 Equal Pay Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination in the workplace, both on gender, race, and other ways. The contraception rights for married couples, which was a Supreme Court case. You've got Title IX, which outlawed discrimination in education. You've got abortion rights, which, yes, have been rolled back. But during 1973, you had abortion rights being given in Roe v. Wade. Then you had the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which outlawed discrimination in credit opportunity. Then you had at-home pregnancy tests becoming available. That was a very fundamental change for women. And then you had the Pregnancy Discrimination Act in 1978. The women that we have interviewed at the lab and are interviewing grew up, went to school, got married, entered the workforce, had children before and during this time frame. Their experiences were fundamentally different than mine. Their experiences were fundamentally different than the students at Penn State, and their experiences illustrate the necessity of these laws, the importance of learning and teaching HerStory, women's history, right? And the need to keep working toward gender equity. So today we have a panel of 4 former students of the Manglona Lab who each interviewed women for this project. So we will start with Emily. Emily Newton is a JD candidate class of 2024. She is the student works editor of the Penn State Journal of Law and International Affairs. She is a family law unit intern with the Legal Aid Society of Rochester, and she was a member of the Manglona Lab in the fall of 2022. Emily, let's start with you. If you could tell us who you interviewed and why you chose to interview them.
Yeah, I interviewed Eileen Smith and Martha Scott. Those were 2 of my 3. They were both Jane Collective members, which was an underground abortion network before Roe v. Wade had been passed. I chose to interview them because I have had an extreme passion for reproductive justice, and they revolutionized abortion access before Roe v. Wade, and I admired them. So getting the chance to interview them, I was extremely grateful. And then I also interviewed Barb Dubin, who was an advocate through her role as a social worker up until she recently retired. And I chose to interview her because I had heard stories of how she revolutionized the pants movement. And her school, as she was growing up, she fought for women to be able to wear pants. And I knew she probably had amazing stories, so I chose to interview her.
Thank you. Next, we have Annie Vigil. Annie is a JD candidate, class of 2025. She is treasurer of the Women's Law Caucus, secretary of the Corporate Law Society, and she was a member of the Manglona Lab in the fall of 2022. 23. Time flies, yeah? Okay, who did you interview and why?
So I interviewed Linda Koppel-Trout, who was the first female state Supreme Court justice in Idaho. The reason why I chose to interview her was because I grew up in Idaho and I was really looking for an example of a female trailblazer and someone for other young girls to look up to. And I found her, and it was just so impressive to me, and so crazy to me that Idaho didn't have a female state Supreme Court justice for so long, and then she was Chief Justice in Idaho. And then I interviewed Dr. Kathleen Hendricks, who is co-author of a book called Conscious Loving. It's about relationships, and she also has her PhD, and I wanted to interview her to really try to understand what it would be like to be someone who goes through their PhD at that time, co-authors a book with her husband that's about relationships and is quite progressive. And then I interviewed my grandmother, Nana Vigil, who worked at the LAPD. And I chose to interview her because I'd always heard stories growing up about what she did, but I don't think anyone ever explained to me the magnitude of the things that she accomplished until I was in high school at her retirement party, and I saw how many people came and how many achievements she had. So I really wanted to learn more about her story.
Thank you. All right, next we have Erica Abelhair. Erica is a JD candidate, also class of 2025. She's president of the Environmental Law Society, secretary of Outlaw, and a member of the Manglona Lab in the fall of 2023. Erica, who did you choose to interview and why?
So I interviewed Greta Kammermeyer, who was a military nurse, and she is a lesbian, and she was kicked out of the military for admitting that she was queer. And so she sued the military in the federal courts, and she won. As a queer individual, I just found that really inspiring, that she really went to bat for queer people everywhere, especially in that time, because we all know being queer was even less accepted back then. That did result in the don't say gay, that's Florida now, in the don't ask, don't tell policy, and she continued to fight for queer rights until that policy was overturned as well. I also interviewed Sue Ellspermann. She is actually from my hometown in Indiana and went on to be the lieutenant governor of Indiana for a while. She now serves as the president of Ivy Tech Community College in Indiana, which is one of our largest public education institutions. Just to see a woman from a tiny town like mine with 2,000 people in it go on to be one of the highest offices in the state and to be a representative for women in our state was really impressive. And I actually grew up in the same house she grew up in, so I felt very connected to her, and getting to know her better was really wonderful. And then finally, I interviewed Dr. Helen Morrison. I knew her name and it just like completely blanked. She is a psychologist who primarily focuses on forensic psychology. She has interviewed a lot of very prolific serial killers to try and understand the psychology of why people kill. And she actually has the brain of a serial killer in her home. So she was a very eccentric and very interesting person to speak to as well.
And finally, but not least, we have Dan Smith, a JD candidate class of 2024. He is Chief Justice for the Graduate and Professional Student Association, and he was a member of the Manglona Lab in spring of 2023. Dan, who did you interview and why?
So I interviewed Jane Kuntz, who I actually grew up as her neighbor. So it was really interesting to be able to speak with her and kind of learn more about her life, having just kind of seen her as this sort of second motherly figure in the backyard kind of thing. And then I also interviewed Joanne Fran, who has a top role at a marketing agency out of Ohio, who really provided interesting perspective that I didn't necessarily receive from everyone else. And then I also interviewed Krisha McCurdy, who was the aunt, who is my friend Kaylee's aunt, but is also just a woman with a wonderful, eclectic, interesting life. And I really enjoyed having the opportunity to speak with all of them.
Excellent. So any of you can can jump in here. So what was the most surprising or shocking thing that you learned during any of your interviews?
Well, first I'll just say in general, I think we forget how recent some of these changes are. It's really easy to think, we all went to college and Title IX was just there. And I think we take for granted how recent that was and how many women are still alive that had to deal with their day-to-day lives without having protections like Title VII, Title IX, Equal Pay Act. And so I think just hearing those stories really grounds you in reality to the fact that that wasn't that long ago that this kind of discrimination, which still happens, but was much more prolific.
Yeah, similar to that, I think one of the most shocking things was how their stories were still relevant to today, and I saw similarities between their stories and what I've heard from other women and their experiences, like the sexism they have faced in the legal field even today. And a more specific story, Martha Scott, she had explained that when she went to movements like the civil rights movements, she brought her stroller and her baby because she had no one else to take care of her child. And I never thought before about the different roles of women converging, their role as a mother, but also their role as an activist too. And how it's back then is, yeah, and how that's probably the same today as well.
In preparation for one of my interviews is probably when I learned one of the most shocking things. I was playing around with the idea of asking the question of whether or not it was Dr. Kathleen Hendricks. She wanted to keep her last name when she got married because she got married later in life and she had already filled all of her education with her previous name. And Professor Scholes and I were in office hours talking about asking this question. Professor Scholes brought up, well, when was this? Like, what year was this? Because like legally you had to take your husband's name. And then we did some research on state by state to try to figure out when each of these states changed these things. And I just thought that was so surprising because it felt like something that no one ever talks about and is like often overlooked. And it was like a choice that they didn't get to have. It was just, this is, you're getting married, you legally have to take your husband's name. So I thought that was quite shocking.
So this one's a little more on the sillier side, but I guess with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, I sort of expected there to be more of this trend of women immediately wanting to go get credit cards and immediately get their name on property and everything of that nature, and that just wasn't the case. And a lot of the women just didn't even think about doing so or couldn't because their property was already in someone else's name, or they're like, so I think that was sort of this interesting, like, oh, they didn't immediately take advantage of something either because they couldn't or there was just not enough awareness.
So did you find that each of these laws, was it a light switch moment where, boom, okay, we passed Title IX, so now there's equity in education. Boom, we passed Title VII, so now there's equity at the workplace. Did you find that it was a light bulb or no? Go for it, Dan.
Yeah. No. To say the least, no. It was something that always took at least some time to get to, or some time to like educate and make a movement bigger. And yeah.
I would say no, because we still have issues today. I know Professor Scholes came to our law and equity class and told us how there's a Title VII case where a woman was moved from her position into another position solely because she was a woman. And now the Supreme Court has to decide, did that violate Title VII? Because we don't know. So no, I don't think it was a light switch.
I also think no, because socially there was a lot of, it takes time for things to become socially acceptable. And so I think a lot of the women probably faced and have told me that they faced troubles with that, of like feeling like they were allowed to do it, even though they could legally do it, but just socially.
One of my witnesses specifically, Dr. Sue Elsperman, she got a degree in, she got a master's degree, or a PhD, excuse me, in engineering. And as you can imagine, that still is not a female-dominated profession, and especially wasn't back then. And she still works in higher education. So she was able to kind of walk me through the process, and as somebody, and the changes she saw, and I know if she was here today, she would tell you that there are still issues with implementing Title IX and people having equal treatment in the school setting, and I'm sure elsewhere as well.
So speaking of Title IX, did any of your witnesses talk about whether once Title IX was passed, to be sure, Title IX required equality between the genders and the races with respect to education in educational areas. Did any of your witnesses talk about whether like the foundation was built for equity once Title IX was entered, or did they have to do things to build that?
I can't remember anyone necessarily specifically talking about that, but going back to Susan Elsperman, she went through undergraduate and doctorate program, and she intimated to me that she didn't have a lot of female classmates, she didn't have a lot of female professors, and so even though Title IX was technically established at that point, she didn't necessarily feel like she had a lot of support from other females in her field. I don't think we really got specifically, though, into the broader educational environment.
Anyone else? Okay. So given the advancements in equity, like what we saw on the timeline, which of those advancements do you think had the biggest impact on the women you specifically interviewed?
I would say definitely for Eileen and Martha, Roe v. Wade, although I interviewed both of them after Dobbs v. Jackson, but I would say Roe v. Wade revolutionized their work. No, that's not the right phrase, but I think that was it was an amazing moment for everyone who was advocated for abortion rights. So I would say Roe v. Wade.
Can you explain a little bit what the Jane Collective is or was?
Pre-Roe v. Wade, abortion was illegal in many, many states. And so for people who became pregnant and didn't want to be pregnant anymore, the Jane Collective was a group that they could turn to. It was an illegal group because abortion was illegal, but they had this whole system where if a woman needed an abortion, they would reach out to somebody who then would reach out to Jane, and they would meet and they would perform an abortion. It wasn't, originally they had a doctor perform the abortion, and then the Jane members themselves started to learn and perform the abortions. And Martha Scott specifically, when she was giving an abortion, the police raided, and when the police came in, they were looking for the doctor. They were like, "Where's the doctor? Where's the doctor?" Because they saw no man. They assumed he climbed out the window because they could not fathom that a woman would be the one giving an abortion. Yeah.
I would say for the people that I interviewed, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was very influential. And I think that just having that power to be able to take control of your own finances and be able to put your name on the house and things were just so important to them.
I think to Emily's point, every individual was impacted by a different law, a different court case, whatever. Obviously for Dr. Greta Kammermeyer, it was her own court case against the military and being able to reinstate her right to serve in the military. So I think it just kind of demonstrates that each individual was impacted by one of these different laws, and that they're all kind of necessary to fill in those spaces.
Yeah, I think I would also say the Equal Credit Opportunity Act as well, because out of all of the laws I brought up or like events that I mentioned, each of the women I interviewed were able to pinpoint exactly like when they got their first credit card or when they got their name on property for the first time. So I think that impact was pretty significant.
Did they mention how they felt about that?
Not entirely. I would say though, it like excited or just content, like it's like something that is deserved or something that's right, kind of.
So which, were you inspired by anything you heard during these interviews?
I could gush about Greta Kammermeyer forever. She's like my role model. But she specifically outlined how she knew she was different from being a little kid, and she got married to a man and she kind of felt like it wasn't right even as she was doing it. And so she kind of had that queerness as a part of her for her whole career. So when it finally manifested in her having to sue the US military, like that was a big thing for her, obviously. But she never directly told me this, but just the way she mentioned she felt different for so long, I think it really, I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry. I have a point here, I promise.
Were you inspired by anything you heard?
Yes. So I thought, you know, the fact that she knew this about herself, even if she couldn't identify it, and all along it was kind of there pushing and pushing, and it was something she knew about. And so when the time finally came that she realized, like, oh, I'm a lesbian and this is important to me, and if I have to sue the US military, I'll sue the US military if that means getting the job I want and being who I am at the same time. And so it was kind of like her whole life led up to that moment. And so when it finally came into being something really great, even if there was like a little period in there of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell that wasn't so great, she then amended that later on too. And so it was just like this lifelong journey leading her to making this huge impact for, I don't want to say millions, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So it was definitely just, like I said, she is so inspiring and I could gush about her forever.
Well, and maybe when you consider family, friends, and loved ones of the people, maybe it is millions. I think it's probably millions. Anyone else?
I can't think of anything specifically said, but I was overall inspired hearing their stories and how they overcame the sexism and misogyny they faced. It just really reminded me that I'm here because of all the women that fought and paved the way for me to be here. And we are here fighting the fight for the women in the future, especially in times when it feels like we're going backwards in times. And Eileen Smith mentioned how when she was growing up, there wasn't many examples of what women could do or what they could become. And I think that's really changed, and that's really shown with all the interviews we're doing, and that will also be on the website for women in the future to see and have examples of what women can accomplish.
I think what was really inspiring to me throughout my interviews was each of my three women grew up with such different backgrounds in such different situations. For example, like my grandmother wasn't able to continue her education through high school. And then Linda Trout went to law school, right? But they all faced very similar challenges throughout their lives. And there wasn't any one thing that they had, like a character trait or like something that they learned that got them through that. It was basically just like they all like paved the way forward. And to me, it really shows that like it doesn't matter what kind of situation that you're in, that there's like hope that you can make a change and a difference and be really creative with the solutions of how you persevere through these things.
And just to echo Annie, I think it's this self-determination that's really inspiring, that it's in spite of everything bad in the world or all the pressures, there's still the ability to succeed and have a family and have a happy life.
So I asked you all earlier which advancement you think made the most difference in these women's lives. If you were to hypothetically ask them, what do you think they would say?
I think a really big one in a couple of my interviews was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, just because it was echoed over and over again, even in my classmates' interviews, that basically they would have to hide their pregnancies from their employers, because once their employers found out, it was like, okay, you're not going to work here anymore, and reapply when you're ready, when you have a kid, I don't know. And so I think that that is something that a lot of the women experience that is like has a stark difference today, that they would be able to easily pinpoint and point out, being like, I had to start over after I had my child.
Yeah, I would say if not equal credit, probably Title IX. I think like Jane, for example, was in long-term elderly care, and Joanne was one of the top people at a marketing firm. Like, these are things that education really impacts, and I think that if I were to ask them, they would probably be most content and happy with Title IX.
I think my women probably would have said Roe v. Wade. I think having safe and accessible abortion, or they would agree that having safe and accessible abortion is important to being able to control your reproductive autonomy, which is also important for you to be able to go into the workforce or do what you hope to be able to do. So I think they would also say probably Roe v. Wade.
I think they would probably say the Equal Pay Act, kind of in conjunction with Title IX. All three of my women had doctorates of some kind, and being able to get there is the education part, but once they're there, getting their fair pay is definitely important. And we know that it's not always applied evenly or fairly, but to have that avenue to be treated the same as their male counterparts in largely male-dominated fields is definitely beneficial, was definitely beneficial to them.
So do you think you would have ended up in law school had you grown up at the same time these women did? And Dan, that's for you too. Even though you were allowed in.
I'll kick it off. So ironically, no. I also don't think I would have, but I think that that's more of a product of the strong women in my life, which, but I'm very proud of like my mom and how much she's been able to do with her life growing up, like very much impoverished and things like that, and always kind of putting it into me that I can accomplish these things. And so I think that had it been a different time period, that advice and that push might not necessarily have been there in the same way. I'd like to think it would have been, but I kind of have my feelings.
I would say probably no, sadly. All of the interviews I had, they all expressed that there were fears for women in the household, but also in school and work, how women, if they went to school, they were going to become secretaries or they were nurses or teachers, like very feminine roles. So no, I don't think so, because I think based off what, similar to what Annie said earlier, even if I was allowed to socially, I don't think it would have been okay.
Yeah, I'll preface mine with an it depends. My mom is the youngest of 10 kids, and my grandparents very much wanted all 10 of their kids to go to college. So I know I would have had that support from home if going to law school is something I wanted to do 50, 60, 70 years ago. But like Emily said, I don't know with the social pressures that going into a field like law, especially with the way families were kind of viewed at the time and the expectation that a woman be able to care for the children, I don't know that it's something I can confidently say I would have done.
I'm going to say definitely not, because even when I was deciding to apply to law school now, I struggled with having clear role models in my community that I could look up to and be like, okay, they're a female and they're a lawyer and they did this, right? I think the community that I grew up in was very sheltered, and there was a lot of expectations that were put on myself and my friends at a very young age that were difficult to overcome. And so I think that having any additional hurdles in the way definitely would have slowed me down.
What was the most difficult part of this project for you?
It was finding people who were willing to talk. And I don't know if that was a product of me being a guy asking women to talk about women's history, and that's kind of an interesting conversation. But in the same sense, it was, I think there was this level of shyness or this level of, I don't know if it's unwillingness, but it definitely made things more difficult to find people and also talk to them and be like, and hear their concerns and hear why they might not want to do the interview, and comfort that and level with that. So that was definitely the hardest part.
I think that might be a product of you being a man. I don't know if you two can reflect this, but I had women who could not wait to talk to me. I had very outgoing, outspoken women. I think the hardest part for me is figuring out how to discuss these topics, because some of them are very sensitive, with people whose shoes you can never truly be in. We can read about and understand that Title IX and Title VII and all these laws are on the newer side, and that these women went through life with it as they were changing. But I think, for us, it might be easy to say, well, do you or don't you want to have kids? And that answer, but that wasn't necessarily an option for women at the time. So just figuring out how to communicate these things in a way that's understanding of the very different situation they were in.
I also think that one of the biggest challenges was getting the women to feel comfortable during the interview in a way that they weren't afraid of their stories being misconstrued. A lot of these topics are very, very personal, and they haven't had a lot of practice talking about them. And they haven't had people who want to know these things, or the audience, to present them. So finding the right words to say these difficult things and to ask these questions and to respond was probably the hardest part for me.
I think the hardest part for me was that there were so many women that I wanted to interview, and I was so close to interviewing them, but because of schedules, it didn't happen. Like Brenda Fagan, who was a prominent feminist during second wave feminism. She's amazing, and I would have loved to interview her, but I couldn't because of schedules. That was pretty difficult.
Did you hear any stories that you found funny or that you wanted to share?
There was one story where Eileen shared with me that they broke into the school bookstore and then they ripped up all of the Playboy magazines because they were just fed up with the objectification of women. And then they got locked in there and they had to get their way out. It was a great story.
Do you remember how they got out?
No, I don't.
They pulled the fire alarm.
Yep. But it was such a great story.
I remember that story.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I have one. It's kind of a funny story because of the way she handled it with grace and her reaction. But Linda Trout, when she was elected as Chief Justice to the Idaho State Supreme Court, one of the fellow justices that was with her on the bench asked her, well, Linda, what do you want us to call you? And she was like, Chief Justice? And then she was like, what other things would you like to call me? And he was like, no, like that's what I'll call you. And I just thought that the way she reacted and handled it with such grace and shut down, and there was no question and moved on. And then I just can imagine the room in that moment, feeling both for her and kind of laughing at him, because why would you ask that? Like, where were you going with that?
Any others?
I'm honestly blanking, but I know I was rolling when I was rewatching I think maybe all of my interviews, but especially my Greta Kammermeyer and my Helen Morrison interviews. They were cracking me up, but I unfortunately can't remember specific stories right now.
That's okay. Nope. Okay. All good. Are there any questions? Anyone have a question? No? Any questions on, yes?
I guess one of my questions is, for the purpose of the entire project as a whole, it sounds so crass and I apologize.
No.
Like what's the purpose of the project as a whole? Is it creating like a database for women to come back later and say, this is who came before me?
That's a lovely question, actually. So the purpose of the project is essentially that, to capture these stories, because as Erica said, and others have said, I think we forget that this wasn't that long ago. Certainly no one sitting up here has been denied access to a college or university because of their gender, but Erica, wasn't it Dr. Ausperman who was denied access to a school because of her gender?
Yes, so Dr. Sue Ellspermann wanted to go to Rose-Hulman, which is a really good math, science, engineering school in Indiana. And they didn't say you don't get in because you're a woman, but the things they said, and they heavily implied that she didn't get in because she was a woman. And, you know, she ultimately said she thinks she was much happier at Purdue than she would have been at Rose-Hulman, but she also never got the chance to find that out because they just didn't let her in. And, you know, she's in her early to mid 60s, so this really was not that long ago. And so being able to highlight that is really important.
And then also you're looking at, first of all, you're looking at rights being taken away. You're looking at the Equal Rights Amendment still isn't the 28th Amendment. And you have people out there saying that women don't need the Equal Rights Amendment because we're all equal now. But are we really all equal, number one? And number two, how long ago did this happen? And do we need to maybe keep fighting and keep thinking about our rights, not just based on gender, of course, but our lab is specifically about gender. Question on Zoom: did any of the women share any wisdom for future generations of women based on what they went through? Anyone?
Our last question that we asked during the interviews was a little bit about this, about sharing for future generations. And I think what was heavily highlighted in all of the interviews was that we need to continue to move forward, because a lot of the times it feels like we're slowly moving backwards. And so I think a huge advice from them was to be very aware of the things that are going on around you and to constantly be pushing for it, because we've seen that like we have the power to make these changes and we want to continue in that direction.
Yeah, very similar. Just stay involved, stay active, stay learning and doing your best to make the world a better place.
Well, and while we're also talking about things like the Equal Rights Amendment that hasn't yet become an amendment, we also are looking at pay equity. And you've got many states who are passing pay equity laws like the Pay Transparency Acts. You've got pay history acts. So even though we have the Equal Pay Act, we're not yet equal, right? And so we're trying to find those ways to equalize genders, equalize races, and get to equal pay for equal work. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to explain, why do we need this? Why do we need more laws? What is happening? Why aren't we equal? And I think a big part of that is looking at the past and looking at where we've come, where we were, how recent it was that it was okay to not pay equal. I'll tell you a quick story from one of the interviews, and it was actually an interview of my mom. My mom and dad went to x-ray school together. They graduated together. My mom did better than my dad. They both interviewed at the same hospital. They both got the same job, x-ray tech. My dad made more than my mom. And then as they went, my dad was offered opportunities to go into the cardiac cath lab. My mom, the only option she had was mammography. But mammography was a lateral move. The cardiac lab was a step up.
If I can add to that, my brother is a physical therapist, and he graduated in 2019. And two individuals from his class went to the same workplace, and I don't know what happened to them after the fact, but I do know that of those two, the male was paid more at the outset than the female in 2019. So it still happens today.
Which is why Pay Transparency Acts understand what is an employer willing to pay, right? Pay History Acts, not having to tell the employer how much you are currently making, because if you're currently underpaid, they're just going to keep underpaying you. So part of this project is to understand those things and to get it on the website where people can see it and can understand what used to happen. Any other questions? Yes.
Did you, as you were interviewing different people, did you look at the impact of educational level versus how these laws might have impacted access? So we talk about pay equity. If we look at women who have less education, the pay equity is so much larger than women who do get higher levels of education. And as we, as we layer in race, then we see even greater gaps. But I was interested in, did any of the women, and I don't know if all the women interviewed had a certain level of education, but as we look at someone's, like, were these women's parents educated to the fact that they could even kind of push their daughters along, right? So if you, the saying that if you don't see it, you can't be it. So how did that work with some of these women? And were women who came from working class families, did they have equal access to abortions when abortions first became legal? Was that part of this, or was that another complication on this whole thing?
Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I think that was one of my goals in when I was looking for women to interview. Was I felt like we had a lot of women who had access to higher education that had been interviewed, and I was curious about if there would be any differences. And so when I interviewed my grandmother, that was one of the things that I really wanted to highlight. It's not as much a pay equity, but more of an opportunity standpoint that she highlighted for me. She worked for the LAPD and she was in an administrative position, but it was very obvious that she always wanted to be an officer. And so I asked her why she didn't apply to be an officer. And she told me, it's kind of funny, she told me that it was because she didn't meet the minimum height requirement. And then my follow-up question to that was, well, were there other female officers? And the answer was no, there were not any female officers. So that wasn't even a position that was being offered to women. And so I think that in that working class role, it definitely made a difference for how much money she could make, because she only had access to the administrative positions.
All of my witnesses, as I mentioned earlier, did have doctorates, and that wasn't on purpose. It's just how it happened. But Dr. Greta Kammermeyer, her father was a doctor and her mother was a nurse, and she indicated it was made clear to her that being a doctor was more impressive than being a nurse. But she was also not outwardly discouraged, but essentially discouraged from going on to be a doctor because she was a woman. And so even though there were female doctors at the time and she maybe could have done it, it was definitely, she was not encouraged to do so.
Any other questions? Oh, and just to answer the first part of your question, we interview women of all different stratospheres, if you will. So we have women who have never been in the workforce. We have women who have always been in the workforce and have had no children, and everything in between. And we try to get a wide range of experiences because, as each of them have explained, these laws have affected women in different ways, and every woman's experience is different and is to be celebrated. Any other questions for our panelists? Okay, well, before we end, what was the best part of your project?
The best part is just getting to meet these women. I mean, they all have incredibly inspiring stories, no matter their background, no matter their work, education, family life. But they all were, except with the exception of maybe some of yours, all of mine were very excited to speak and just excited to have somebody who wanted to hear their story. And so just getting to meet them, getting to know them. One of mine said that if I'm ever in the area, we should grab coffee. Like they just care so much. And so getting to hear their stories really is the best part. It sounds cheesy, but it's true.
I think that having the opportunity to explore these areas in a really focused way and be able to learn so much about it was the best part for me. I think that I went to a large state school for my undergrad, and so I had never taken any courses like it or had a platform in which it was encouraged for this kind of research and discovery and learning so much about these women.
I was also just very happy to learn about these women and speak with them and learn their life stories. And also to clarify, the women I inevitably interviewed were happy to be interviewed. It was beforehand. It wasn't some bad blood afterwards. They were very. I got nice emails afterwards, but it was very inspiring and enjoyable.
As a women's studies major as an undergrad, I learned a lot about women's history, but I've never got to interview any of them and hear about their experiences firsthand. So being able to combine my passion of feminism and women's history with the law was amazing to do.
And with that, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for sharing your experiences interviewing women. And there are cookies and drinks out back. Thank you very much.